You might have noticed that considering prehistory required a great many educated guesses. We know quintessential changes occurred before written records. The artifacts demonstrate that culture began to outpace biology and human history. Nevertheless, significant questions about how and why remain. Part of the problem is that without any written records, we have a hard time making educated guesses about that fundamental question. What were they thinking? Writing is the key here. In this chapter, you will see that writing will be an important tool in the development of cities, kingdoms, and empires in the ancient Near East. Even if we begin our study with the advent of writing, the story of Western civilization is complicated. The first writing we know of appeared in Mesopotamia, a Greek word meaning the land between the rivers, about 3,300 before the Common Era. That writing was in cuneiform, the wedge-like marks on clay tablets described in the textbook. For nearly 3,600 years, cuneiform was used to write several different languages in the cities and empires of the ancient Near East. Like the Roman script you write with, is also used for many other languages around the world. Then, around the 1st century of the Common Era, cuneiform was abandoned. The meaning of those wedge-like marks was over time completely lost. More than 30 centuries of the history of the ancient Near East, the so-called cradle of civilization, was forgotten. All that remained were a few stories from the Hebrew Bible and texts of the ancient Greeks. Then, what was lost was found. In 1835 of the Common Era, an Englishman named Henry Rawlinson climbed the face of Mount Behistun in present-day Iran to see a monumental mystery. What was this language in the peculiar wedge-like script carved into the mountain? Seeing the figure of an emperor receiving conquered peoples, Rawlinson believed the inscription was a royal decree of the Persian Empire that had been described by ancient Greek writers in the Bible. Strangely, the writing also resembled markings pressed into clay tablets among the ancient ruins in Mesopotamia, modern Iraq. Copying the inscriptions, Rawlinson and others eventually recognized that they were a single decree copied into 3 different languages. All the languages used cuneiform script, but Rawlinson and his collaborators suspected one of them was Old Persian. Old Persian was no longer spoken or understood, but a closely related language, Avestan, had survived in the scriptures of the ancient Zoroastrian religion. Using these keys, Old Persian was deciphered, and the secrets of cuneiform slowly revealed. Unexpectedly, this code breaking also led to the recovery of several unknown and long forgotten languages. From these lost languages, the history of the cradle of civilization described in the textbook was partially restored after more than 1,500 years. The story of the Egyptian language and its hieroglyphic script is no less remarkable. The first hieroglyphs appeared along the Nile River about 3,150 before the Common Era. However, unlike cuneiform, neither hieroglyphs nor the Egyptian language were adopted by other cities or empires. Instead, the Egyptians used Akkadian, a language from Mesopotamia written in cuneiform, to administer their conquests and communicate with other empires. Along the Nile itself, however, Egyptian and its hieroglyphic script survived for nearly 36 centuries. They survived despite successive invasions and occupations by Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, and Byzantines that began in the 7th century before the Common Era. Yet eventually hieroglyphs had been abandoned, suppressed, and forgotten by the 4th century of the Common Era. Egyptian also ceased to be spoken. But as in the case of Old Persian, a language closely related to Egyptian, Coptic, barely survived in religious rituals among Egypt's minority Christian communities. Again, what had been lost was found. Less poetic than a monument in the desert, the Rosetta Stone was discovered in Egypt in 1799 of the Common Era by French soldiers using rubble to build a fort. Like the Behistun inscriptions, the stone was inscribed with an official decree. In this case, the text was a pronouncement by a Greek-speaking pharaoh of the 2nd century before the Common Era. Two of the three versions of the decree were in Egyptian, but carved in two different scripts, hieroglyphs and Demotic. These sections were incomprehensible in 1799. The third version of the decree, however, was in Greek, a language with a continuous history from the 9th century before the Common Era. From this Greek and knowledge of Coptic, Egyptian hieroglyphs were deciphered by the last third of the 19th century. Why do the sagas of cuneiform and hieroglyphics matter? It is crucial that you understand history is not a continuous or complete story, though it may seem so from the textbook. Historians make educated guesses based on the surviving evidence, sometimes fragments of evidence. In the case of the ancient Near East and Egypt, the fragments seem impressive. Think pyramids and ziggurats, or even the Epic of Gilgamesh. Yet these remains are a tiny portion of the societies and cultures of the ancient Near East and Egypt that fascinate us. We continue to learn, but so little remains that nothing like a complete story can be told. Instead, we combine our knowledge of these two cultures with the stories of other cultures that have been more continuously and fully understood and debated, namely the Jews and the Greeks. This is somewhat ironic. During the periods we are discussing in the first few chapters of the textbook, the Jews and the Greeks seem like minor characters in the drama. They became major players, in part at least, because their writings, rather than those of the Akkadians, Assyrians, or the Egyptians, continued to be known and discussed when the knowledge of cuneiform and hieroglyphs had been lost. The founding fathers of the American Republic discussed the Bible, Rome, and Greek cities, not Hammurabi's code. And why did the little guy survive? That is too big a question to finish in this course, much less this video. However, we can start by highlighting the general trends of civilizations in the ancient Near East and considering aspects of the history of the Jews as a case study. In the Jewish scriptures, there is an early form of history that is very different from our understanding, but we can begin to find clues as to what were they thinking and identify aspects of civilization in the Near East that are still discussed and debated today. Before we begin, as we did with prehistory, let's try to imagine the history of early civilizations as a diagram. In that first box, during the period from 4300 BCE until around 2000 BCE, we would have the growth of agrarian civilizations in Mesopotamia, first into city-states and then territorial states, some called kingdoms or empires. Here is a map showing the cities. And now another map showing their consolidation into an empire under Hammurabi. Then in that second box, during the period from 2000 BCE to around 1200 BCE, these territorial states were interconnected by trade and diplomacy. Here is a map showing these states around 1400 BCE. And a graphic illustrating the system of trade and diplomacy. This is generally known as the Bronze Age. Finally, around 1200 BCE, all but one of the Bronze Age states suddenly collapsed, and it was 3 centuries before new Iron Age empires, really superpowers, began to reorganize, swallowing any little kingdoms, such as Israel and Judah, that emerged after the Bronze Age collapse. Here is a map of the small state kingdoms surrounding Israel and Judah. And then a map of the Neo-Assyrian Empire that absorbed them before it too was destroyed. As you read the textbook, you should take notes as to how these periods differed from one another. Remember, This video is not a substitute for reading the textbook. You will be responsible for materials outside these short videos. When we left prehistory, men and women in Mesopotamia were being pushed, or pulled, into agricultural civilization. First villages and then cities with specialization and more social stratification emerged. As cities grew in size, they also began to produce monumental buildings, such as temples or palaces, and establish extensive trade networks, meaning that products created by specialists like weavers or potters were exchanged for goods, often luxury items, from places farther away than the nearby fields or pastures. All of these developments depended on more social organization and social control. Hunter-gatherers and villagers probably didn't require much organization or social control. If there were disagreements or conflicts, dissenters might just leave. There was more game and more land over the next hill. As the population of Mesopotamia increased, the land over the next hill might be occupied by someone else, and you might have to dig another irrigation ditch. Some scholars refer to this crowding of farmers into villages and cities as caging. If leaving were not an option, then cities probably required some sort of social control to settle disagreements, organize the exchange of goods, construct granaries, build canals, raise fortifications, and fight wars. Once again, you should be thinking, how do you know? To begin with, we have artifacts depicting these trends. Here is an object you have seen before, the Standard of Ur. We're not certain what the object was used for, but we can see evidence of specialization, stratification, and increasing social control. The complexity of the society is revealed in the very materials used to make the standard. The lapis lazuli, a blue semi-precious stone, in the standard is evidence of an extensive trading network that reached as far as Afghanistan. More complexity is revealed in the images. On the peace side of the standard, a variety of products are presented to a king of Ur. The producers are at the bottom, the king at the top. Hierarchy. Above the peasants are also other servants of the king. We see musicians together with what seem to be priests and scribes. Specialization. Scribes are a reminder of a momentous development, the emergence of writing. The first uses for writing were not, sadly, poetry, but inventories. You might memorize stories, even laws, in spoken verses, and yes, several ancient societies put their laws into poetry. But tracking how much you have and who gets what changes too frequently for memorization. Writing was used to administer the state or the city. For example, one of the first examples of writing is this record of beer rations distributed by the city of Ur. That sounds like poetry to me. But more importantly, we now know a teeny bit about what they were thinking. We can begin to understand who gets what, and we can puzzle over why. In a moment, we will also consider how writing became more than a matter of inventories and lists. Inventories were not the only source of social control. Kings like Sargon and Hammurabi also relied on violence to defend their territory, extend their trading networks, and keep their subjects under control. The Standard of Ur illustrates this well. On the war side, soldiers, corpses, captives, and chariots demonstrate the central role of violence in Mesopotamia. Other images, such as the stele of the vultures, depict disciplined soldiers standing in a shield wall and trading spear stabs with opponents. Notice the crushed corpses and severed heads. This discipline is vastly different from the raiding and running typically seen in prehistoric images or among 20th century Stone Age peoples in places such as the Amazon. Why did people submit to rule by kings and risk shield walls? Many doubt that force alone would be enough. If you are willing to fight the king's enemies in a battle, why not fight the king too? The rulers' toolboxes contained more than bronze swords and chariots. One important tool was religion. Kings often claimed their authority was from the gods. When you obeyed the king, you obeyed the gods. This monument from Ur depicts a king worshiping the moon god Nana. The monument also describes how the king constructed a ziggurat for Nana. The king controls access to the gods. We've already discussed writing as a tool of administration for rulers. Rulers also used writing to assert their devotion to religion and justice, demonstrating their right to rule. The Code of Hammurabi is a good example. Scholars now believe that the code was not a list of laws for use in a court. Only scribes could read cuneiform anyway. Like monuments listing his military conquests, this monument describes Hammurabi conquering injustice. The so-called laws are more like a list of how he ended disputes among his subjects. This conquest of injustice, like those over foreign enemies, was closely tied to religion. If you had the full code in your textbook, you would see that it begins with a list of Hammurabi's close relationship with all the gods worshipped in his empire. It ends by him calling on those gods to curse anyone who ignored Hammurabi's example. The kings claimed to provide salvation, security, and justice. They described themselves as shepherds protecting their flock from other kingdoms and from fellow subjects. Some scholars now believe that there may have been something to these claims. Despite the armies and wars, people who lived under a strong king were less likely to die a violent death than people who lived without kings. You want prosperity, security, and justice? You need a king sent by the gods. Or do you? Whereas most of the writings we have from Mesopotamia are from kings, either in the form of inscriptions or cuneiform tablets baked in the fires of destroyed palaces or royal libraries, the Hebrew Bible contains stories from a different perspective. You might be thinking, can we use the Bible as an historical source? The answer is yes, but carefully. Scholars consider the Hebrew Bible to be an anthology of different genres of sacred literature, such as poetry, fables, history, and religious laws, lovingly collected by the Jewish people during particularly dramatic eras of their history. Whether or not you believe this collection was ultimately guided by God or humans, it is clear that the writings date from different times and have been recorded by different hands. Among the histories, parts of which can be corroborated from other evidence, are stories about kings. Refreshingly, they give us a view of kings not from kings. In the first book of Samuel that you were assigned to read this week, there are 3 slightly different accounts of how the people of Israel transformed themselves from a confederation of tribes into a kingdom, sometime after the collapse of the Bronze Age states, say around 1100 BCE. You should consider how the part of 1 Samuel you read differs from the accounts of kings by the shepherd kings of Mesopotamia. Are kings a blessing or a curse? In 1776, of the Common Era, Thomas Paine tried to use this biblical account of kings to persuade colonists in North America that they could in good conscience break with King George III. Think about it. One reason for the uncertainty about kings in the Bible is the history of Israel. Except for the short period between the collapse of the Bronze Age states and the rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire during the 8th century BCE, the people of Israel were caught between powerful states in Egypt and Mesopotamia, the proverbial rock and a hard place. The kingdoms of the Jews were relatively weak, and eventually they were destroyed. This image depicts the destruction of Lachish, a city in the kingdom of Judah in 701 BCE. The kings that the Jewish people had clamored for could not protect them. Eventually, even Jerusalem was sacked, the temple destroyed, and Jewish leaders deported. As one scholar has noted, By every rule of ancient statecraft, that ought to have been the end not only of a Jewish kingdom, but also of the Jewish religion and the Jewish identity. Even the mighty Assyrians all but disappeared from history when their empire was destroyed. Their culture only was recovered from the forgotten ruins of their capital 12 centuries later. Yet the Jews survived. They survived in part because they began to separate their identity and religion from either a kingdom or a particular temple. Kingdoms and temples might be destroyed, but the collection of writings that explain their history in terms of their faithfulness to the commandments of a transcendent God who governed all of humanity endured. Copies of the scriptures were easier to replicate than the temple in Jerusalem, and the synagogue could maintain the culture and identity of Judaism when kingdoms and citadels were conquered. Want to rule the world, or at least survive? Write a book.